Hello and good day, and welcome to the first formal lecture of our e-learning course specifically geared towards assisting national focal points in their work within the Unccd process. Yes. This is the first formal lecture as regards the course, the e-learning course, and in this lecture I would like to address two basic questions. The first is the question as to what really is the Unccd. So I'll give you an introduction as to what the Unccd is. It will cover issues such as its history, its purpose, how it functions. But these are all in general terms. Then we'll go on to question 2, which will deal with the national focal point. Who is the national focal point, or what is the national focal point institution? How does it function? And what is its role within the Unccd process? So again, welcome. And I hope that along with the course papers, because as I said in the introductory lecture, there are course papers that you can use. Along with that, and along with this, the convention of the Unccd, plus the relevant decisions, you will find the information necessary to make you competent enough to complete this course most successfully. So, let's go to question 1. An introduction to the Unccd. What is really the Unccd? Well, as you know, Unccd is an acronym for United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Now, desertification has been a serious problem for a very, very long time. And we all know as to what took place in the 70s in the Sahel region. And the governments of the world realized that this is a question that had to be tackled, and had to be tackled seriously. But how do you do that? Because in most cases it was felt that desertification was just a problem for some countries, and it wasn't really a global problem. However, the world's view of this particular question changed fundamentally in 1992 at what is called Unccd, which is the United Nations Convention on Environment and Development, which took place in Rio in 1992. And at Rio, the governments of the world agreed that there should be an international convention that addressed the question of desertification and drought. Now, this agreement led to the creation of what we know today as the Unccd. This is an international convention, and the negotiation process for it began immediately after Rio in 1992. These were completed by 1994 in Paris, in France, and the convention was then opened for signature. By 1996, the convention had achieved the 50 ratifications necessary for it to enter into force. So the convention then came into force in 1996. So we know that this convention has been around for quite a while now. So that is basically the history as to how the convention was created. But people don't just create conventions because they want to do so. They created the convention because, as I said, there is the problem of desertification, land degradation, and drought around the world. So the purpose, therefore, is what is important. It's not just the convention, but the reason, the objective, the goal why it was created. And the reason for this is because the world has come to understand that we cannot just be involved in development, but we have to be involved in what is called sustainable development. Now, as many of you would know, there's something called Agenda 21. And in Agenda 21, some basic principles and rules are laid out as regards how the world should proceed, how the governments are, and how the peoples of the world should proceed as regards global development. However, Agenda 21 was not really a sort of agreement that forced countries to act. They could act if they want to, or they could refuse to act. A convention is a different thing. It's a legal instrument that binds you because you sign it, you ratify it, or you accede to it. Okay? So this is why the convention is different from Agenda 21 in terms of its legal status. This is important to understand. Now, as I said, you don't have a convention simply because you want one, but there's a purpose. So the purpose of this convention is to contribute. If you look at its first 2 articles, it tells you it wants to contribute to sustainable development by addressing the question of sustainable land management and drought. So this is the purpose of this convention. It is a sustainable development convention, and it is known as one of the Rio conventions. It is one of the Rio conventions because these were the 3 conventions that the governments of the world agreed to, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biodiversity, and this convention, which deals with drought, desertification, and land degradation. Now, it is one thing to have a convention and say this is what you want to achieve, but in order for you to do so, there must be a way of doing that. In other words, you have to put in place some structures and a mechanism for those structures to function. So first and foremost, we need to understand that the Unccd is country-driven. In other words, it is the country parties who have decided to set up this convention, and without them, it cannot work. Okay? So it's a country-driven process. And right now, the Unccd has about 195 parties, including the European Union and the African Union as well. It is one of the most widely ratified or acceded to conventions in the world. Now, the parties are key to the whole process. They, the governments, the nations, are the ones who have taken on obligations and who have rights and who have responsibilities. So the parties are therefore the ones who push the process. But how do they do this? They do this through a process of partnership. Now you need to understand something which is very special about the Unccd. The Unccd is the only sustainable development convention which divides its parties into developed country parties and affected developing country parties. And based on that division, these parties have different roles. The developed country parties are supposed to assist the affected developing country parties in the implementation of the convention. The affected developing country parties have a responsibility to implement the convention effectively on the ground. This is very important to understand. Secondly, the Unccd also has partnerships at all levels, meaning the implementation process takes place at the national level, and so you have to have national sort of partnerships going on, but also at the sub-regional level, at the regional level, and overall at the global level. In other words, partnership is fundamental to the whole process of the Unccd. There's some other things I want to mention as regards a general introduction to the Unccd. As I've said before, you cannot just have a convention, but you have to have institutions. So the convention has several institutions. One of these is the Secretariat, from which I'm speaking to you, and our job is to facilitate the implementation process. Outside of that, you have what is called the global mechanism, which is really a mechanism to help you access finance and technology for the implementation of the convention in affected developing country parties. Outside of that, the convention has some basic institutions. There's something called the CRIC, which just simply means the Committee for the Review of the Implementation of the Convention. This is one of the major subsidiary bodies of the convention, and its task is to review how the implementation process is taking place. There's also something called the CST. The CST just simply stands for the Committee on Science and Technology. And that is the science part of the process. In other words, you cannot really and truly address a problem if you're not addressing that problem in an informed way. In other words, you have to know the facts and the figures. You have to know the reality on the ground. And that is what the Committee on Science and Technology seeks to do, to bring science into the process. Outside of that, of course, you have to understand how the process functions. Firstly, the Unccd has what is called the COP. The COP is the Conference of the Parties, and it's the highest decision-making body. The COP is the one that takes decisions as to how the process proceeds. Okay? And this COP, we presently meet every 2 years. Okay, so every 2 years there's a conference of the parties where all the country parties come together and make decisions as regards the process. Now this takes place every 2 years. So what happens between those 2 years? Well, what really happens is that you have what is called a Bureau of the COP. And that is made up of the president of the COP, the head of the Bureau, plus some other members. In all, they make up 9 of these people. And they represent all the regions of the world. And this brings me to another important thing I wanted to say to you. That is, the Unccd, as I said before, is special in 2 ways. I mentioned the first one, which is that it divides the parties into developed country parties and affected developing country parties. Outside of that, the Unccd is designed along regional lines. That's important. No other convention is like that. So the Unccd has 5 annexes. 1 for Africa, 1 for Asia, 1 for Latin America and the Caribbean, 1 for the Northern Mediterranean, and 1 for Central and Eastern Europe. And so therefore the convention clearly functions along regional lines as regards its implementation. But this comes back to the question of partnership. As you can see, because it is structured in that way, it is essential that there is partnership, not only at the global level, but at the regional level. This is fundamental. The Unccd goes further and encourages partnership also at the sub-regional level. So what you are looking at is that as a process, it operates nationally, sub-regionally, regionally, and globally. The last conference of the parties took place in Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia, and this took place last September 2013. And now the convention is looking forward. What will we be doing for the next 2 years, meaning 2014 and 2015, when there will be a next conference of the parties. Finally, as an introduction, I think I need to mention this to you, that after the convention had been in force for 10 years, which is 2007, it was realized that implementation was not taking place as effectively and as efficiently as was necessary. The Conference of the Parties, the COP, then agreed to adopt what is called the 10-year strategy. And this 10-year strategy runs from 2008 to 2018. It was adopted in Spain, Madrid, Spain, at COP8, which took place in 2007. Now, the difference between the strategy and the convention itself is that the strategy aims at what is called result-based management. In other words, the strategy clearly states that for the next 10 years, meaning from 2008 to 2018, there are specific goals that must be achieved by the country parties. There are specific things that must be done in the affected developing country parties. In other words, the strategy is aimed at actually seeing results on the ground. And that is the fundamental difference between the strategy and the convention itself. The convention itself is full of what is called universal, or if you want, blanket norms, but the strategy is more specific. Finally, apart from this lecture, as I've said before, when you look at the website and you're taking the course, you will see that there are course papers, and these course papers further point you to documents that you can use, including, as I said before, the convention and other decisions taken by the COP. So along with this lecture is not enough. You need also to read the course papers and to read the additional documents that might be indicated in those course papers. So that is as regards our first question.